Well, good morning all to our virtual Friday edition of Core 140. Thank you for joining me digitally. As we're beginning today, we're going to go back to where we left off, and that is in the year 800 with our new friend Charlemagne, who has just ridden down to assist Pope Leo III against his adversaries. The Pope had been threatened by political and religious opponents. Charlemagne rides down in the fall of 800 and does what Charlemagne does best, which is crack heads together and ensure the safety of the papacy. Having completed his mission, Charlemagne decides to remain in Rome throughout the winter to avoid the harsh snows that have accumulated in the Alps. While he is there on December 25th, he attends Christmas Mass, and at that celebration, the Pope calls Charlemagne forward. Pope Leo III lifts a crown, places it on Charlemagne's head, and proclaims Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor, a controversial title throughout European history. Charlemagne says later that if he had known what the Pope was going to do, he never would have gone forward to receive the crown. Because essentially, what the Pope is implying is that he's got the power to invest Charlemagne with his authority, not just spiritual authority, but political authority as well. And Charlemagne and other rulers will see this as a problem. Charlemagne claims he does not need papal authority to give him political strength, that he is, in fact, a political leader by virtue of inheritance, by virtue of his father seizing power over the Franks, and he doesn't need the Pope's endorsement to make that real. This is the beginning of a debate that is going to last throughout the entirety of the medieval period and actually will move into the early modern period as well. In fact, it will get more complicated during the early modern period as Protestants and Catholics begin to square off during the Reformation period. Essentially, the question at stake is who has got the greater authority? Spiritual leaders like the Pope and the church hierarchy, who've got responsibility over the souls of men and women, or political leaders like Charlemagne, who've got responsibility over the physical lives of those who live under their rule, and by implication, possibly the spiritual lives of those people as well. Where does their authority begin and end? This is going to be a long debate throughout the medieval period, and it will lead to some very intense, sometimes violent clashes between church and state. Now, as we've discussed previously, Charlemagne had created an empire with its headquarters centered around the city of Aachen. Aachen was a majestic city with a great deal of things to recommend it, and the greatest thing that it had to recommend it was the fact that it is located in Central Europe. And this puts it exactly in the middle of the territory that's controlled by Charlemagne. And so, therefore, it makes it a perfect capital for him. Now, later on, he is going to shift his focus towards education and towards attempting to make his population as literate as he possibly can. We've already mentioned the rule of St. Benedict and Benedictine monasteries. I want to talk a little bit more about those today. Remember that we mentioned that in those monasteries and in the schools that they sponsored, people were not only educated, but manuscripts were copied as well. Charlemagne's legacy includes the preservation of some of the most important ancient manuscripts that the Greco-Roman world gave to us, including, of course, the text of the Bible, especially Greek and Latin manuscripts of the New Testament. There are about 1,000 monastery schools founded under Charlemagne's reign, and those schools are administered by a British monk named Alcuin of York, who Charlemagne invites to come to Aachen, sets him up with all of the perks he could possibly want, and instructs him to install the rule of St. Benedict in all of these monasteries. Remember, the rule of St. Benedict was crafted in the early 500s by a guy named Benedict of Nursia. It was intended to be a monastic rule that was both rigorous and also reasonable. Some of the early monastic rules have really resulted in a lot of physical harm to people who had taken their austerity too far. Benedict wanted to create something that satisfied that longing to really give your utmost for Christ, while at the same time preserving these people's health so they could actually minister over an extended lifetime. And so this is the rule that's installed in these monastic schools founded during Charlemagne's reign. Remember that the Benedictine order required you to take three vows: a vow of poverty, which is something that college students know a lot about, a vow of chastity, meaning you'll not only be sexually pure, but you also will devote your life to Christ. So you will not have a marriage relationship. You will, in fact, remain single and, quote, married to the church. And then, of course, a vow of obedience. You give absolute obedience to the hierarchy of the monastery. This is Charlemagne's signature. If you wanted something to sell on eBay, copy that to a napkin, and maybe you can try to convince somebody you actually ran into Charlemagne. Carolus Magnus. Though Charlemagne himself was a great advocate of learning, this is basically his signature in sort of abbreviated format, so he didn't have to write it out. He himself never learned to write his name out. This is Carolus Rex, the title Charles the King or Charles the Emperor. So, for a little bit, Charlemagne's empire seems to yield the possibility of a reunited Europe. And this is, in fact, going to be the fever dream of almost everybody throughout European history after the collapse of the Roman Empire. There are a number of significant individuals that will try to recreate a unified European empire like the Roman Empire. Charlemagne is one of the first of those. And you'll have a whole collection of people, including the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. You'll have the Muslim leader Suleiman, who has ambitions for that never get close to being accomplished. You'll have, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, and most infamously, Adolf Hitler in the 20th century. They all conceive of the idea of some kind of resurrected or reconceived Roman Empire. Charlemagne's is the earliest, and it might have possibly been the closest to succeeding, but that is going to be disrupted after the reign of his son. Charlemagne's son is a guy by the name of Louis the Pious, and he embodies his nickname. He is called the Pious because he is a very faithful Christian, a very humble, very sincere, prayerful person. And throughout the course of his reign, he manages to keep Charlemagne's holdings together and to rule with a fair degree of competence. He's not quite Charlemagne, but he's not bad. At the end of his reign is when Charlemagne's kingdom begins to come apart. And it's not because of any kind of political or social disruption. It is because Louis the Pious is, in fact, pious. He's a very nice guy. He decides that he wants to break with medieval custom and give all of his sons the inheritance of his kingdom. This is not typical during the medieval period. Usually, what they will do is give the inheritance to the eldest son. And then the younger sons will have to either find another occupation, maybe they'll become a scribe, maybe they'll find employee with another noble, or in some cases, they will take monastic vows and they'll become a monk. Or in the case of daughters, if they don't get married, they become nuns. The reason why the inheritance is kept with the oldest child is because if you were to subdivide and keep subdividing the inheritance generation after generation, obvious problem you run into is the fact that the inheritance will get smaller and smaller and smaller. The more it's subdivided, the more it's weakened. So typically, rulers will grant the inheritance to the oldest son, let the others fend for themselves, and in doing so, keep the kingdom together. Louis the Pious, however, wants to be fair, and so he equally divides the inheritance with each of his sons. His sons are Louis the German, you can guess where this is going, Charles the Bald, and Lothar the First, who's got a great Germanic name. Louis the German inherits the area to the far east of Charlemagne's kingdom. Lothar is going to get the central region, and Charles the Bald will inherit much of what today we know as modern day France. In fact, if you look at the map, essentially France is there in Charles the Bald's kingdom. This all is going to be codified in a document called the Treaty of Verdun in 843. After Louis the Pious dies, this will be the subdivision of land. Lothar is going to die earlier than his brothers, and when he dies, Charles the Bald and Louis are going to gobble up his territory, and so their territory will expand. Basically, you can tell what's happening here. When all is said and done, and as these original sons, the original inheritors of this kingdom, die, what you're going to have is the beginning of the formation of France and the German states. Central Europe's going to become the German states, eventually under the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the previous kingdom of Charles will become the kingdom that we know today as France. Now, the Treaty of Verdun doesn't do Europeans any favors because it subdivides Charlemagne's empire at just the point that some new groups are entering into Europe and causing some disruption. There are three groups of people on the move during the 800s and early 900s who are going to cause some serious issues. The Anglo-Saxons, who eventually end up in Great Britain, Muslim groups on the outlying frontiers of the Byzantine Empire are putting pressure there. There's a group called the Magyars that enter into Central Europe and cause some disruption before finally they make peace with the Germanic peoples. The Magyars eventually come to be called Hungarians. This is the root of what will be the future Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so they'll ultimately settle in Central Europe and be assimilated into the dominant culture. And then, of course, there are the so-called Northmen or Norsemen, Vikings, or what we know them as today, people from Norway, Scandinavia, and Denmark, who eventually are going to come south and attack monasteries along the coast of Great Britain and Europe as well. They start with an attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 on the eastern coast of Britain, and then they're going to continue to wreak havoc. For a while, they are going to be the bane of Europeans' existence. They will creep down the waterways of Europe in their well engineered boats, and they will bring terror to monasteries and to outlying villages. In France, they're able to actually create a treaty with Norse invaders, and they will grant them territory on the northwestern coast of France. They'll call this area Normandy because it's occupied by the Norman peoples, people of Viking northern extract. And so that is the way that that territory gets created. The Norsemen are going to be an issue for European cultures from about the early 800s through the mid 900s. By the time you get to the late 900s, they have started to assimilate in the localities where they've settled. And so you begin to see a lot of Viking Norse influence. It's one of the things that makes English culture and the English language so dynamic because they're going to settle in Great Britain. They're also going to settle in Normandy. And there's going to be a lot of cultural exchange between the Anglo-Saxon Germanic peoples of Great Britain and these new arrivals. In fact, it's at this time that some of the most significant kingdoms that we're familiar with in the European world are created, including in the late 800s, the Kingdom of England. The person who's given the greatest responsibility for creating England is a person from the western state of Wessex by the name of Alfred. Alfred's eventually called Alfred the Great. He rules the people of Wessex from 871 to 899. He battles against Norse invaders who are wanting to try to take over the entirety of the area. They have created a region in the east of England called the Danelaw, and Alfred's going to end up engaging in battles with these Norse powers. Eventually, he is going to manage to come to an understanding with the Norse powers. He establishes his seat of rule in London, the former Roman colony of Londinium. And ultimately, he will be the guy that establishes a lasting monarchy in England. Royal genealogists claim that Prince William and King Charles are directly descended from Alfred the Great, even with all the twists and turns in the English royal family. You've got some moments when some interesting things happen, particularly in 1714 when they have to call the German cousins to come over because Queen Anne doesn't have any surviving heirs. But royal genealogists claim that Alfred's descendants are still on the throne of England today. In Germany, the office of Holy Roman Emperor goes dormant for a little bit and then it's revived in the 900s under a ruler named Otto the First. In 962, he is proclaimed Holy Roman Emperor, and from that point forward, you've got a chain of Holy Roman Emperors from 962 until 1805, when Napoleon finally kills off the Holy Roman Empire. When he does it, it's a mercy killing because it's been falling apart for a long time. Remember again Voltaire's famous phrase, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor really much of an empire. In France, they fight much harder and it takes longer to achieve political stability, but they do finally achieve that in the late 900s. The first person proclaimed king of France is a guy by the name of Hugh Capet. His family line is going to begin what's known as the Capetian dynasty in France. Capet's problem is going to be a very powerful nobility in France. The French nobility is very strong, and they will resist very much the attempts of French kings to impose their rule over the larger countryside, which means there are going to be many times in medieval history when the French nobles are more powerful than the French king. And in fact, in one bizarre case, in the late 1100s, the English king, Henry II, is also a vassal of the King of France. And he's really more powerful than the King of France. Along with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry II owns more territory in France than the French king does. So in France, royal supremacy is going to take a while to really enforce. It's not really going to be till after the Hundred Years' War in the 1400s that we see France become a strongly unified entity. So I've mentioned a couple of things we should probably explain in a little more detail. I mentioned the term vassal, and we've already talked about in previous classes the term feudalism. What is a vassal, and what in the world is feudalism? Well, basically, feudalism and manorialism are the political and economic systems that govern the medieval world. This is a world where money does not have the kind of purchasing power it has at most other times in history. Instead, the basic economic unit of this world is land. If you have land, you have power. If you don't have land, well, then you're up the creek. I mean, basically, you are not a very powerful individual, and you need to ally yourself with someone who does have land. So, land is the basic building block of the economy. The feudal system works according to a notion known as the idea of the great chain of being. The great chain of being is the idea that God has organized the universe in a very stratified and deliberate manner from God Himself ruling in heaven to the lowest vassal or serf living on earth. And God intends for there to be structures of authority that are stable, that are known, and that are observed meticulously. And so, with this social order, there is safety and stability, and everyone knows their place, which some people take great comfort in. As Americans, we rebel against that idea because the very notion of our revolution lay in challenging the idea that people were in a certain place and they couldn't advance. We Americans often prize the idea of being able to advance, to better your situation, to better your circumstances in life. That is not a medieval concept. Most medieval people were born in a certain position. Most of them expected to die in that position as well. In this system, you've got, first of all, the feudal lords, the greatest of them, of course, being the king or the emperor, but there being many nobles underneath them that are also feudal lords. These are the persons that control the land. They will parcel this land out to individuals that are known as vassals. The vassals are going to be the people who serve the feudal lords and work the land. If you are a vassal who can equip yourself with armor and horse, and therefore serve the military needs of your lord, you have the title of knight. This is what sets you apart from your ordinary vassals, because you will also render military service to your feudal lords. In exchange for the rights to the land that the Lord gives you, you will render to him a certain amount of the produce from the land every year. You will obligate yourself to serve the feudal lord by engaging in a ceremony where you will lift your hands and the feudal lord will clap their hands over yours and thereby signify that the two of you have been joined in a feudal relationship. You'll recognize this as a very popular posture of prayer that becomes well known during the medieval period. It's sort of people acknowledging that God is the supreme feudal lord, and so they lift their hands towards God in prayer. The reason why this system is called feudal is because the grant of land that was given was sometimes known as a feudum, or it could also be called a fief. And so a fief is the grant of land that is given to you by a feudal lord. Now, most people who are given fiefs are able to stay or leave the land at will. It could imperil your welfare if you leave the land prematurely, like you need a place to work. It's like leaving a job, but you do have the freedom to be able to leave a fief. There are some fiefs, however, that have the condition that you and also your descendants cannot leave the land. You must remain in the feudal lord's service for perpetuity, for the rest of your life and for several generations after as well. People who live in this condition are known as serfs. Serf is someone who is tied to the land. They almost are slaves, and they are definitely below the vassals in regard to their status in society. And so, if you're a serf, you're occupying the lowest rung of the social and political ladder, and essentially you're tied to the land. You have no option as far as being able to relocate or change your status. Now, there is one other term here that is very important to think about as well. That term is benefice. You may be asking, what is a benefice? Essentially, a benefice is a grant of feudal land that is given to a clergyman or to a monastery. Yes, the church is embroiled in this system as well, which means they're going to be competing obligations here. Remember our previous allusion to the conflict between church and state, this question about who has got the greater authority during the medieval period? Well, this is a lightning rod for those debates because the church is enmeshed in the economic and political system. You've got bishops and archbishops and even the Pope who has some feudal responsibility. And so they've got both ecclesiastical responsibility, responsibility over the souls of people, and they've got some political skin in the game as well, which further complicates these questions about who has got the greater authority. On paper, this looks very convenient. It looks very stratified. It looks very solid. In reality, it can get pretty complicated sometimes. You can have situations where people have multiple feudal lords. What do you do if one lord goes to war with the other and you've got obligations to both? You can have situations where people are the overlord of one area, but subordinate in another area, as in the previous example we talked about, where Henry II is the King of England, but he owns territory in France. And so technically, he is a vassal of the King of France, though good luck trying to enforce that King of France. It doesn't go well for him when he tries. And to add injury to insult or insult to injury, Henry II actually marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is one of the most powerful nobles in France, and also the King of France's ex-wife. So she divorces the King of France, ends up marrying Henry II, and together they're going to have one of the most dysfunctional families in medieval history, which is saying something. They'll end up having four sons, all of which don't get along with each other. Each of the parents, the king and the queen, have their favorites. And in fact, Henry and Eleanor have such a big falling out that at one point he actually imprisons her for a brief period. So Thanksgiving and Christmas are very stressful in Henry's family, to say the least. But this is only one illustration of how feudalism, it can get complicated. Again, this triangle sort of illustrates the way the system is supposed to work. It sometimes works that way, but it can also get extremely complicated as well. And so you've got a situation where during this later medieval period, a political and economic system emerges that is very dependent on land and very determined to put people in their particular place. There is an area they must occupy in the social order, and if you step out of that, you do so at your peril. Now, along with the political advances and the social advances tied to the feudal hierarchies, you've also, of course, got a tremendous expansion of the power of the church. We've alluded to this already, and now we're seeing it unfold. One of the greatest leaders of the Catholic Church during this period was a man who came to be known as Gregory the Great. He was a political reformer early in his career, but in the year 590, he is chosen to be pope. And he assumes not only spiritual responsibilities, but political responsibilities within Rome as well. This is again a moment when that fusion between church and state is happening, at least in some parts of medieval Europe. Gregory is going to be credited with the development of a number of doctrines, including the doctrines of penance and purgatory. He may be given too much credit sometimes. That is definitely up for debate. Gregory is an avid student of Augustine. He loves Augustine's writings. And to the end of promoting Augustine, he will delve into passages from Augustine that are lesser known. And sometimes passages where Augustine is more speculating than he is prescribing. Sometimes Augustine is just saying, what about this? Or could this be a possibility? And he's not necessarily saying this is a hard, fast theological statement. It's something he's speculating about. Gregory is known for often taking those statements and making them more definitive than Augustine intended. And two of the places where that happens is in the areas of penance and purgatory. Penance is a mistranslation of the term that today we render repentance in places like the book of Romans. Repentance is the idea of a turning around, that when somebody becomes a believer, they're supposed to leave their life of sin. Penance is the idea of making restitution for things that one has done wrong. And Gregory begins proclaiming the idea that though we are saved by grace, we also need to continue to engage in acts of restitution, acts of penance that demonstrate our sorrow over sin. Along with this idea of penance is the notion of purgatory. Augustine speculated at one point, what if there is an intermediate place between heaven and hell? A place where you're not being eternally punished like you are in hell, but you are kind of making restitution for your sinfulness in that place. You're expressing your sorrow over the continuing sin in your life. And eventually, you'll work your way to paradise. You'll work your way to heaven. But until you get there, this is a place for reflection and for moving past your sinful behaviors. Purgatory is that place. Gregory pushes this idea and says, yes, there is a purgatory, an intermediate place between heaven and hell. And if we are faithful with our penance, then we can push beyond that and be received straight into heaven when we die. But it may well be that we end up instead in purgatory if we have lingering sin to express our sorrow for. There is a whole system of relics, of indulgences, of ways the church tries to help people overcome continuing sin that grows throughout the medieval period as a part of this set of beliefs. We will, of course, see this cause tremendous conflict later as the Reformations break out in the 16th century and Protestants raise questions about the notions of purgatory and penance, indulgent systems, and things that are designed to help people get extra credit, you might say, extra dispensations of grace for sinful behaviors. Luther will eventually challenge this during the 16th century and say, grace and grace alone is the foundation for salvation. Protestants will argue you are received through Christ and through Christ alone. Any act you do doesn't add to or take away from that salvation. But definitely during the medieval period, there's a whole system emerging of indulgences, of restitution, and penance, which is going to provide a lot of fodder for very powerful systems to develop alongside the church. Systems that will eventually concentrate a great deal of wealth in the hands of the church. Another thing that Gregory does during his pontificate is that he is going to be the one who sends a papal mission to England and is responsible for bringing England into the Roman Catholic fold. There was a parallel Christian movement arising from Ireland, led by St. Patrick, that had eventually jumped over the Irish Sea to Scotland and started to spread south. Eventually, those two movements are going to meet in the middle of England with the sort of more Celtic Christian movement fusing with the Roman Catholic movement that's coming from the south of England. One more thing Gregory is given credit for, but which we really don't think he's responsible for, is the so called Gregorian chant. The Gregorian chant is an a cappella form of Christian worship that emerges during this period. It is beautiful, it is powerful, it is still very celebrated around the world today. And Gregory is often given the credit for it. Gregorian chant is a name given to this practice based on Gregory's name and influence. Far as we know, he did not actually birth the Gregorian chant. We think this developed more gradually. He was certainly someone who appreciated it, and it's in his honor that it's named, but he's not the one that created Gregorian chants. And so essentially, you've got a picture of a medieval world, very stratified, local rulers beginning to emerge, establishing a plethora of local kingdoms throughout this period. And it's also a world in which finally, towards the end, you are getting a little bit of a population recovery because agriculture is beginning to become more sustainable again, and it's becoming more profitable in its yields. And so, as that begins to happen in the late 900s, as we move towards the year 1000, you do start to see a population increase. You start to see agricultural yields get better. And along with that, you're going to see some recovery of European cultures after these long centuries following the fall of Rome when there have been so many struggles and challenges. We will talk more about those next week as we talk about the High Middle Ages. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you soon.